for the speaker, so just know that is happening if you want to ask questions. Our aim is to take Karen Bales first, who is from the NEU and he's actually working and has to get back to teaching. So when he's finished his contribution, I'll take some Q&As and any contributions about what he's said then for 10-15 minutes, and then we'll move on to Fatima and Nick. And there will be Q&As and contributions after they've both finished speaking. If you want to ask a question or anything, can you use the electronic hand, which is under reactions usually, or if you've got an old Zoom, it's under the list of participants, because I won't be able to see who's got their hand up otherwise. And everybody will stay on mute until we ask you to come off mute. It'd be helpful if you only use chat if it's really important, because otherwise it can be really distracting for people. There's two transcription services. One is Otter, which you can reach by clicking on the top left of your screen, and also live transcripts, which is on the bottom. And if you go to live transcripts, you can switch it on and off by showing subtitles. And it will, if you click that again, it will go off again. Because I know somebody's already asked, how do you take them off? I tend to take them off, but they are very useful for people. And if anyone's been watching Low Party Conference on YouTube, they are better than the ones they've been using, which has kept many of us most amused during some speeches. Right, my name is Joan Twelves. I'm on the Zero COVID Steering Committee. I'm a member of Vauxhall Labour Party and Unite Community, and I've been involved in Zero COVID for close to a year now. I was very, very angry about what was going on from the start of the pandemic and the way the government was handling it. And as somebody shielding, I felt very vulnerable in that respect, even though everybody says we don't like the word vulnerable. When you are shielding, it is actually how you feel. And so I was quite glad to be able to channel my anger into a campaign which was covering all aspects of the pandemic and was trying to build within the labour movement. At the moment, we're in a rather strange situation because the government, and to some extent the Labour, let alone ordinary people, are pretending that the pandemic is over. Certainly the government very much so is, and is trying to totally ignore the fact that hospitalizations, cases and deaths continue to rise. There's over 1,000 deaths a week, which I don't find acceptable, and they are preventable, and they would be prevented if the government agreed to some very simple measures in terms of mitigation and precautions, very simple ones that we've been doing for a long time. And actually an awful lot of people, despite what the press say, are still doing that. I've had contractors come to my home who are very clear that their firms make it clear that they have to wear masks when they go into people's homes, and that the kind of customer has to maintain social distancing, which is quite pleasing. But they're not all doing that, and the government is certainly would prefer that they weren't. I think it's a pity that Labour's conference didn't vote to discuss as a priority coronavirus. That again indicates that people tend to think it's all over or want to pretend it is and hide their head in the sand. Given the way the government has behaved for the last 18 months with very, very little opposition other than a few complaints from Labour, and certainly no alternative having been posed, I think it's really incumbent on all of us to keep campaigning and keep putting out the message that simple mitigation methods like social distancing, masks, an effective and proper find, test, trace and isolate system would make a massive amount of difference. The scientists on IndieSage published on Friday their winter plan, and it includes all those mitigation methods in it. And I would certainly recommend that people track it down very easily on Google. But what they've also said is unless such precautions are implemented immediately, there is a serious danger that more intrusive and wide-ranging restrictions will become necessary later. And I think that is a very dire warning. So Karen will be talking about the issue around safety in schools, and obviously what applies in schools as a workplace applies in all other workplaces. And then Fatima and Nick will be taking us into the other aspect of this pandemic and another aspect of the way the UK government is behaving disgracefully in terms of the necessity for people's vaccine globally available, and so that we can actually ensure that the pandemic could be over, because it will not be over until the whole world is safe. So I'd like to introduce Karen first, and I hope everybody will appreciate what he says. Karen, you've got 10 minutes. Can you unmute yourself? Does that work? Yes.
Thank you. Thank you very much, everyone, for attending. I'm Karen Bales. I recently finished a term as an executive member of National Education Union. I'm also a member of the World Health Network, and I was a co-author of Independent Sage's Urgent Report for Safer Schools. But most importantly, I work full-time in a mainstream secondary school, giving up my lunchtime to speak to you. The current situation in schools is unsustainable and unethical. The pursuit of normality is in conflict with reality. We've had the removal of isolation, the switching off of contact tracing within schools, and it has solved nothing. Rather than year groups move into remote learning after a dozen or so cases across classes, we now wait an extra week and then move to remote learning after 30 to 50% of students have tested positive. This is particularly clear to see in places like Leicester, which opened earlier. Several of my friends working in those areas have already got their schools closing. The pandemic was never the problem. It was the high infection rates that we were seeing. And the pandemic is not over. No matter how much the media are bored with it, right now in schools, it is like working in March 2020 with no mitigations, with our registers filling up with absences. They're rising. We're starting to struggle with staffing issues as well. This is what you're going to see, very similar to just before we went into lockdown in March, where we contacted the Department for Education to say that schools are going to be closing, whether the government likes it or not, because we simply do not have the staff to keep the pupils safe. And as we can see, there are already hundreds of schools across the United Kingdom which have already shut. The messaging about the pandemic almost being over is having a real impact as well. The weekly lateral flow testing that we have in schools is in decline. The last data I saw said it had gone from 80% of students participating down to 60%. Having these done at home also makes them incredibly unreliable. The government's failure to recognise the Delta systems is having a massive impact. I'm seeing students in my class which have all of the appropriate symptoms for Delta. In another country, they would be sent off for testing. Here, they're given paracetamol and put back into my classroom. This is happening across the board, and is leading to infected students staying in schools, meaning larger outbreaks, more disruption. And we're also getting this messaging that students are having flu-like symptoms, and they've taken an LFT, which is negative, so they can come back to school. PCRs are not being taken by a large percentage of the students that are absent at the moment in many schools. The official line is that schools merely reflect community transmission, but a third of cases are in students, whilst rates flatline or decline in other age groups. I can literally watch the spread of infections across my seating plans radiating out from an index case. For instance, one of my classes, the front table was sick. Then 3 days later, the next table was sick. A couple of days later, the next table was sick. And now I'm almost out of students in that class. The suggestion by the Royal College of Paediatrics to quit testing healthy children will solve nothing and will only make matters worse. My students aren't off because they're of test results. They're off because they're sick. Students are getting sick. They are having time off for this. And the argument that 50 to 70% of students have antibodies that keep being quoted in the media isn't supported by the ONS, which currently estimates around 25% of students have antibodies. And it does feel a lot like this narrative of herd immunity almost being reached that we saw last year to disastrous effect is now being played out as an argument in schools. We still have arguments against masks in schools, despite the CDC in the United States producing some very good data to prove that schools without mask mandates are 3.5 to 4 times more likely to face disruption and outbreaks. The government has still failed to answer the Freedom of Information requests that were put in May regarding their decision to remove masks. We have not seen any of the evidence behind this. I doubt they actually have a decent base. And all of this comes before we have even begun discussing the health implications to students and staff. I have colleagues with long COVID. ONS estimates reckon 122,000 education workers have suffered from long COVID. I have students with long COVID. There are over 9,000 students who haven't recovered for more than a year since contracting COVID. That would just be the first wave in March. So now we will wait to see how many more come from the winter wave and from the current Delta wave. And the sad thing is that none of this was inevitable. We could have vaccinated our students earlier. We could have invested in ventilation. We could just be putting masks in. And instead we are offered CO2 monitors, of which most schools haven't had any yet. We haven't had any arrive yet. And even if I do get a CO2 monitor and stick it in my classroom and discover that the air quality is poor, there is no further action to be taken because we can't put in those ventilation movements. So for all the talk of the government, talking about catch up and recovery, we can't recover. We're going to be falling further behind. We've got more disruption. And once again, it's going to be the same disadvantaged communities which are going to be hit hardest, which is going to have the biggest impact, and it's going to further increase inequality. And it feels very much like most of the government and much of the media do not care about this.
Hello, Sarah.
No, sorry, I've just been interrupted by a student. I'll stop here because I'm aware of time and I've got some year 12s trying to get into my room now. I'll quickly take some questions.
Thanks very much, Karen. Yeah, has anyone got any questions or quick contributions, bearing in mind?
Sorry.
The working teacher.
Okay.
Electronic hands, please. Anne.
Hang on, I'll just start my video so you can see me, Karen. Hello, Karen. I'm on the TUC Disabled Workers Committee, and I come to Zero COVID meetings as often as I can because, as you may be aware, 6 in 10 COVID deaths were among disabled people. So we are one of the protected groups, like Black and minority ethnic people, who have been disproportionately targeted. And of course, if you have both hats, Black, if you're Black and disabled, your likelihood of infection increases. Now, you're talking about in the schoolroom. What about and the fact that we know that the government is no longer recognising the need to shield, but the need to shield is still there for some pupils and some teachers and educators and classroom assistants, all the stuff. And I know NEU is trying to work policy on this, but I just wondered what your thoughts to all of us as a non-specialised educators would be on this and how we can support. I mean, from the health and safety point of view, which Janet Newsom is our on-call expert, I know that ventilation is a key thing, but why didn't the government do a rapid programme of ventilation over the summer? And we're back where we are with nothing done. So I'd love your thoughts. Thanks.
Is there anyone else before Karen comes back? So you can take 2 or 3 questions at once. No? Karen, do you want to respond to that? Unmute yourself.
Yeah. Thank you very much. So regarding what we can do, we really need to put pressure on investing in ventilation in schools. If we cannot do that, then there is some really good initiatives in North America by the Corsi and Rosenthal boxes, which are custom-made DIY, ventilation units, which can be bought with very simple resources. And can come in for around £80 to £100. 2 of them will do a large-scale classroom. So we could be ventilating our classrooms to a decent standard for about £200 if we have community fundraising and community action, which is a project that the World Health Network is on and will be very shortly releasing some details on. Besides that, we need an update of the Delta system, of the Delta symptoms, to make sure that people are given the right testing at the right times. Because at the moment we are missing a lot of cases in schools, which is going to have a knock-on impact to education. I do apologise. I've got some sick formers now trying to use the room, so I'm going to have to log off now and get along. Thank you very much for listening to me. I hope the rest of you have a good conference.
Thanks very much, Karen. That's brilliant. Thank you. Not easy to try and combine several lives at once. Right. I am now going to ask Fatima to speak. Fatima is joining us from South Africa. Thank you very much. She's a human rights lawyer and social justice activist and the founder and director of the Health Justice Initiative. So Fatima, would you like to take over and start telling us about what's going on in South Africa and around the world?
Sure, thanks. You can hear me okay?
Yeah.
Great. And so I think that Nick and I will kind of do a joint input, and Nick will deal with what the UK government and the Labour Party could do in the next few months and in the next year as well to address the very grave issue of vaccine injustice and vaccine apartheid, which is now playing out in my part of the world. So I think the last time we spoke, I told you I was still waiting for my vaccine shots, and so was my mum, who was 75. The good news is that we've been vaccinated. I got my second shot of Pfizer at the end of August 2021. I think many of you got it much earlier in the year. So we are about 7 to 9 months behind North America and Europe in terms of our vaccination program, in a country where we do for now have sufficient supplies, but in a continent where the rest of the continent does not have sufficient supplies. So let me explain some of that. We in South Africa have about 16 million people currently having received at least one shot of the vaccine, but we only had about 21% of the adult population that has been vaccinated, compared to, for example, 50-55% in many countries in Europe, and in some parts of Europe, they've even reached 75 to 80%. So I think your program was running about 9 months before you got to 50%. Ours has been about 3.5 months, 21%. The racist narrative that has now emerged to basically justify the lack of sufficient supplies for the whole of Africa and South America is that Africans don't want the vaccines. And that is something we have to deal with. That is not true. It is racist. It is rooted in similar arguments what was used around HIV/AIDS. We do want the vaccines. We just can't get sufficient supplies of them. And when I talk about sufficient supplies in the rest of Africa, we're looking at less than 5% of people in the whole of Africa have been fully vaccinated, not because of choice, but because there aren't sufficient supplies, because drug companies are still behaving as if they are the most powerful, as if they are God in a pandemic. And we have elected leaders, including Johnson, including Biden, including the transitional German government, and particularly Angela Merkel, up until that she's no longer in office, but the German government have not been supporters, as well as the British government and the US government, of trying to expand global manufacturing to make sure that we can have sufficient supplies in our continent. So we've got less than 2.6% of people fully vaccinated in Africa, which is actually quite a shame. As at September 2021, less than 5% of people who received at least one shot of the vaccine, which is why you'll see two different figures circulating, because Africa is having to rely on multiple vaccine manufacturers, including Pfizer for the 2-dose regimen, Johnson & Johnson for the 1 dose, and then AstraZeneca. And we'll come back to Serum and AstraZeneca and how the British could play a more positive role in that respect. Now, some of my colleagues and I have argued in the British Medical Journal that this constitutes a crime against humanity. It's not a moral crime, it's definitely a legal crime. And I think that more scrutiny and more accountability has to now emerge from the board members of these different pharmaceutical companies. We've put a lot of pressure and attention on CEOs of these pharmaceutical companies, but we now need to get the investors and the shareholders of these drug companies to be on our side and to start asking them to account for the decisions that they've made around the bilateral agreements and around the supplies that they actually haven't delivered both to the African Union and to countries directly. Because remember, we are relying on supplies from COVAX, which can only potentially secure 20% of supplies by the end of 2021. It's revised its forecast down by a quarter. So it cut out 25% of its supplies because the drug companies are unable to meet demand. The second racist narrative, and the reason why I'm explaining this whole long story about percentages and vaccine supplies, is that the narrative of the pharmaceutical industry is that we've got the manufacturing under control, we can make enough vaccines. The problem is the richer countries who are hoarding or who have overbought supplies. And that is partly true, but not totally true, because we actually do need more supplies in the system, and we need more manufacturers in the system. But the companies, as well as a handful of richer nations, including the British government, are still blocking the TRIPS waiver and are still blocking the ability of multiple manufacturers around the world to start scaling up the manufacturing of vaccine supplies. So I just want to give you one quick or two quick examples. The one is around Oxford University and AstraZeneca, and we believe that we still need more support from you in that respect. South Africa is not relying on AstraZeneca. Many African countries are not relying on AstraZeneca. So it's less of an issue for some of us, but it is still quite a significant issue for many countries in Africa, as well as South America, who are relying on AstraZeneca to come through via COVAX through the Serum Institutes. The Indian government has lifted the ban on that. But the systemic issue of why we're having to rely on the Serum Institute in India for supplies of the AstraZeneca vaccine goes to the heart of vaccine injustice and vaccine apartheid, where more pressure should have been put on AstraZeneca to share the technology beyond just serum. So you could have had multiple manufacturers around the world making the AstraZeneca vaccine, which would have had a significant impact on the African vaccine program to be able to get supplies of AstraZeneca or any other vaccine from any other manufacturer. The fact that we all had to rely on a company in India because AstraZeneca and Oxford University signed this ridiculous, non-transparent secret deal with the PR spin of that this was a no-profit vaccine is actually a scandal, and I think is so shameful. It's the reason why COVAX hasn't been able to supply Africa and other low-income countries with the vaccines that we needed. The second is we have companies, for example, this has played out in South Africa. We were entering wave 3. We were waiting for vaccines to be delivered. We were waiting to be vaccinated. We were dealing with death and illness at such a large scale. I mean, we've just come out of wave 3, thankfully. But while that was happening, Johnson & Johnson was filling and finishing vaccines in South Africa. So they'll tell you that they're giving licenses, and they'll tell the world that this is what they're doing, that they're giving a license to Aspen that's based in the Eastern Cape in South Africa with a fill and finish license, not full manufacturing. But those vaccines were coming to you. They were being exported to Europe in the months when South Africa was entering wave 3 and in the months when Africa needed vaccines. The third racist thing we've been told from the beginning of this pandemic is that we can't manufacture. We don't know how to do anything. There aren't sufficient plants with the right quality controls and standards. Well, guess what? We were filling and finishing vaccines, 30 million at least, of which was actually exported to Europe. And we only found that out because we relied on whistleblowers and investigative journalists who were able to tell that story, because all of these contracts, and I think Karim had mentioned access to information filings in his presentation, we can't get the contracts. They are not transparent. The companies are not accountable. We found out through a whistleblower and through the work of the New York Times that the South African government was forced to agree not to impose export restrictions and limitations on Johnson & Johnson so that we could get 32 million vaccines from J&J, which never came, by the way. We only got about 4 or 5 million of that. We've been waiting for months because those vaccines were being sent to Europe. And in return for this deal with Johnson & Johnson in Africa for 220 million vaccines, which we've been waiting for since March 2021, of which maybe only 7 million has actually arrived for all of Africa. the quid pro quo was that our government was not allowed to impose export restrictions on the J&J suppliers leaving South African shores. But you could. The EU could impose export bans and the US could impose export bans. I'm just giving you all these real life stories to explain to you that the vaccine injustice and the vaccine apartheid has moved into round 2, round 3, round 4. It's beyond just, you know, the initial manufacturing deals and licensing. It's playing out in different ways. And just to wrap this up so that I can give Nick a chance, what is happening is that Africa was waiting for AstraZeneca, which has never arrived because of the serum debacle and situation. Because if you limit the number of manufacturers, then you can only rely on one company. So it hasn't arrived. It was waiting for J&J to come from Aspen, which hasn't really materialized because obviously those vaccines are being diverted to Europe, which is why you have 50, 60, 75, in some places, 85% vaccination coverage as of September, and we're sitting on less than 5%. So we're just literally waiting for supplies. But we're being told, don't worry because you don't really want them because of these far-right movements that are so anti-vax and there's so much confusion and disinformation. The CEO of Pfizer said that the problem in Africa is not vaccine supplies. The problem in Africa is that people don't want the vaccines. It's vaccine hesitancy, which is you know the ruse basically to distract us from the issue of vaccine equity. But I think the most disheartening thing, and the part where I just decided we're going to start using the word racist. We're going to start using the words crimes against humanity, was when the British government decided last week to keep South Africa on the red list. We have 16 million people who've received the vaccine that you are using in Europe, Pfizer and Johnson & Johnson. We have been told that we are not regarded as vaccinated, that if we want to travel to your country, we are still on a red list. Large parts of Africa are on the red list, large parts of South America are on the red list, on the amber, so-called amber list. It's like a traffic light system. So the very vaccines that have been approved by your authorities and by the WHO, because we're only using Pfizer and Johnson & Johnson, we're not even using Sputnik or Sinovac. We've been told that we must quarantine for 10 days at our own cost to be able to enter the UK or to be able to enter Italy, and that the vaccines that we have received will not be regarded as acceptable. Our vaccine cards will not be regarded as acceptable. So the exclusion and the discrimination and the racism is now even playing out in rules around travel, rules around entry, and rules around the movement of people. So basically, you know, Nick, I don't know what we're going to do with the British government. All of this is happening while the opposition to the waiver still continues. There's a clear case where we need more vaccine manufacturers. We need the IP to be waived, and the British government continues to block this. You know, egged on by, I think, the Merkel administration and the German government, and hopefully you'll speak to the issue around the waiver and what we can do around IP, but everything is now stacking up against us. And yes, I'm really fortunate to come from a country where we signed these bilaterals and a lot of people have now received the Pfizer vaccine, but it seems that even receiving the Pfizer vaccine is not enough to be able to try and achieve, you know, the same kind of access that you have and the same kind of privileges that you have. So let me end there and hand over to Nick. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Fatima. I think it is so important for people to learn what is happening in other countries, because the British press on the whole is so focused on what goes on in the UK, it never tells anyone. I will move over to Nick. And I'm very pleased to welcome Nick. I'm sure lots of people know him as Director of Global Justice and Global Justice campaigns on a number of key issues. But today we're welcoming him to talk about the people's vaccine. Can you unmute Nick? Is that working? Or Ian, can you unmute him, or can I unmute him? Is that working?
There we are.
Yeah.
Got there.
Yes.
Thanks, Joan. Thanks for the invite. And it's such a pleasure and privilege to speak after Fatima, who's become such a close comrade over this pandemic. The work she's doing in South Africa, I think she underplays, because honestly, we've got to celebrate the victories where we have them. And the work Fatima did in uncovering that Johnson & Johnson contract with the South African government and getting it in the New York Times and enforcing Johnson & Johnson to change their policy and say they would stop exporting vaccines made on the African continent to wealthy parts of the world, and even return those that had already been exported was a major victory. So I pay tribute to you, Fatima. You never seem to sleep or rest, and it's really inspirational to us here in Europe. I thought the point you ended on there last was really important too. That actually even those around the world in southern countries who've been vaccinated with exactly the same vaccines that we have are not regarded as vaccinated by our government here. And this is just shocking racism. And it's going to, as if the inequality weren't bad enough in the world today, and is going to get worse because of the economic as well as social consequences on those countries with low vaccination rates. It's also the case now that it is becoming nearly impossible for some countries to engage in international negotiations to repair the damage of COVID. I mean, we know we've got the UN COP coming up to discuss climate change in Glasgow in just a few weeks now. There are many of us who question whether it's really sensible to have a convention like that in Glasgow at this time. But even assuming it's going ahead, the fact is it is incredibly difficult for delegates and observers and social movements to make it to Glasgow, and as if their voice wasn't already drowned out enough in terms of these global conferences, that's going to get worse. So I just see this whole thing as intensifying and exacerbating the horrendous equality that already exists in the world for a generation if we don't get some control over this. And that's, before we even take account of our own self-interest in vaccinating everyone in the world, because we all know that mutations are going to arise most rapidly in those parts of the world where this virus is allowed to run unchecked. So for so many reasons, I think this has just got to be a priority for all of us working in solidarity with comrades like Fatima. So first of all, let me just repeat a couple of points Fatima made, because I think it's really important to grasp the scale of this inequality. We've got over 65% of our total population here vaccinated, and the whole African continent is under 3%. And low-income countries, if you take them as a group, are even worse. So 0.5% is all they've managed to vaccinate. There are countries like Haiti, which effectively have given out a couple of dozen vaccines. I mean, they just don't have any, even for the frontline workers. Democratic Republic of Congo is in exactly the same situation as that. Meanwhile, we are starting to roll out third jabs, not just for the most vulnerable, which I understand, but for our entire population, US in the same situation. You've got people around the world looking at this who I think can really scarcely believe it, because they've been told for the past year, well, don't worry about it. We know it's going to take longer for your countries to get them, but you will get them because we'll all be vaccinated, and then you can have what's left, essentially. But as if that wasn't a kind of racist and an insufficient response to this question, it's not even true, because the vaccines that are being produced now are still being bought by countries like Britain in order to secure ourselves for, I mean, God knows how many vaccines we think we need per person. By the end of this year, we're expecting, even if you take into account the vaccination of everybody 16 and over who wants one, and third doses to the most vulnerable, we're still going to end the year with about 210 million unused doses. Many of these are expiring all the time. I mean, sometimes we've donated a tiny amount. I mean, we've donated under 9 million at the moment. We normally donate just as they're about to go off. So many of those 9 million reached countries with only a few weeks left of their shelf life. So what are countries supposed to do to get those out at that kind of notice? So this whole idea that, okay, the global south will come second, but it will come second, is now being shown up to be completely untrue. It's not just me first, it's me second, third, and fourth as well. And the very day after the big pharmaceutical corporations announced, don't worry, by mid-year next year, we'll have produced 12 billion vaccines. That's a huge amount of vaccines. The very next day after they announced that, COVAX, the international redistribution mechanism, as Fatima said, announced it couldn't hit its targets and it was going to be 500 million under where it expected to be by the end of the year. So a little bit like, the famines in the old British Empire, where the problem was not necessarily lack of food, but the market mechanism that was driving food from places where it was needed to places where people had money to buy it. Exactly the same market mechanism is working now to intensify inequality around the world. And unless we do something and take on the pharma industry and the pharma model and the intellectual property, which has turned these corporations these are not corporations that spend most of their time researching and developing new drugs for us or for anyone else in the world. They have become like hedge funds. They are enormous financial entities which spend most of their time returning money to shareholders, buying back stock and buying up patents from smaller businesses that create the medicines that we all need, and sitting on that so that they can make the most profit possible. Unless we take on that system, it's going to be impossible to have a world where healthcare is a right for all. And I think if there's one thing COVID does, it opens the eyes of all of us to the inequality and obscenity of that system, and it gives us the opportunity to fight against a system which has been a problem for many, many years. It's not just COVID. I mean, the fact that our antibiotics are becoming resistant and we're not developing any new ones is primarily a function of the fact that Big Pharma sees no self-interest, no profits coming from inventing and researching second wave antibiotics. And so our entire medical system depends upon antibiotics. They are becoming ineffective, and Big Pharma isn't doing the research, right? Because it does none of the essential research unless we give it public money to do it. And the patent system, right at the heart of all of this, which was written by former Pfizer executives in the mid-90s so that they could profit, turned the American-style patent system into international law. It imposed these 20-year monopolies on countries from South Africa to India, right the way around the world. We saw one of the reasons I got into this international campaigning in the first place was the obscenity of the HIV/AIDS crisis, when millions were infected, suffering and dying in Southern Africa, when we had the drugs that could have made their lives bearable and prevented the transmission of HIV and extended people's lives many, many times. And yet we have a market-based system which says, no, these pharmaceutical companies do not have to share this knowledge with you. And so completely unnecessary death and suffering, which has been going on for years and decades. And it's time to end it. So what can we do about all of this? Well, nearly a year ago now, India and South Africa came to the World Trade Organization. They said, there's absolutely no way you should be enforcing intellectual property rights and the TRIPS agreement in the World Trade Organization in the middle of a global pandemic. Lives are too important. They got almost no support from wealthy countries at first, but almost all southern countries agreed with them and backed them. In March this year, May this year, there was a real game-changing moment where President Biden, and we'd all like him to be doing more, obviously, but at least came out and said, yeah, okay, some kind of TRIPS waiver we need to look into. And that was a big moment because it meant that a lot of rich countries that up to that point had been kind of sitting on the fence or objecting without doing very much said, okay, maybe we're going to have to change our minds on this. So things began to shift, nowhere near enough. However, we are now left at a point where there are two major blockers on the world stage. And guess what? Boris Johnson's government is one of them, and Angela Merkel's government is another. We also have objections from Switzerland and Norway. We hope the elections in Norway may begin to change that. And of course, we're all looking today at the news from Germany to see what's going to happen there and whether the elections there will change their position. That could leave us in just a few weeks' time with Boris Johnson being the last major blocker on the international stage. And of course, the World Trade Organization relies on consensus. So his blocking of this proposal could scupper it for the entire world, which would be an absolute obscenity. And so I think we've got to do all we can in the days and weeks ahead to neutralize the British government's position, to put as much pressure, to embarrass them as much as we possibly can. I mean, we're not even talking here about donating the surplus vaccines we've got, although of course we should donate them. I'm not arguing against that. But what we're saying is, If you can't export any of these vaccines, if you can't donate any of these vaccines, the very least we can expect is that you don't stand in the way of other countries producing their own vaccines to provide their own citizens with the medicines they need to overcome COVID-19, because that's what Johnson's doing at the moment. And why is he doing it? Because he is in the pocket of the big pharma corporations who are making an absolute fortune out of this. So a couple of days ago, Amnesty put out a really good report that I'd recommend, saying big pharma corporations are fueling a human rights crisis. Very, very strong language for Amnesty. And they said Pfizer and Moderna alone, those two leading vaccines alone, are likely to make those corporations $130 billion by the end of next year. Right? That is the most profitable medicines in history. In a tiny amount of time. They're sitting on these patents and refusing to transfer their technology. And we've just got to call this out in any way that we possibly can. There's a little bit of hope, not just for the TRIPS waiver, I think, but actually many countries in the world are just saying, we're not going to put up with this anymore. I mean, you know, the UN General Assembly was a real eye-opener last week, because country after country on the political right and political left were calling out and lecturing world leaders on the obscenity of the situation. And some countries now are just, in South Africa, there is a hub to begin working with mRNA, this revolutionary medical technology. And they've just said, we're just going to mimic the Moderna vaccine. Moderna's CEO has become a billionaire from this vaccine, which was created entirely with public money. He's become a billionaire. He will not share his recipe with the WHO-backed mRNA hub in South Africa. So they've just said, well, we're going to reverse engineer it and we're going to make it. It will take us much longer. Many people will die as a result of Moderna's decision, but we're just going to do it. And so I think now we can begin to see the start through the creation of facts on the ground of a very different medical system. And I think, you know, we've all got a really important role to play here, coming from a country, of course, which is doing everything it can to block this, to call that out and to express solidarity with our friends and comrades across the global south. So hope that gives you some idea of where we are, and really happy to take any questions that people have got.
Thanks very much, Nick and Fatima. Again, electronic hands if you've got one, and say who your question is. So if I get some more, I'll take 2 or 3 together. I've got a question myself, I must say. So I will say mine first, which is basically to Nick. I referenced the fact that the Labour Party conference, and this is a Labour Party fringe meeting, was deadly silence on this. And whilst, you know, all credit to Gordon Brown particularly for the work he's been doing, but I don't recall hearing much, if at all, from the Labour Health team or from Keir Starmer. And I would have thought this is the kind of perfect issue, non-contentious, I would have thought, for us, for him to be confronting Boris Johnson on and things like PMQs. Is there any ideas for doing that? So if you could don't take the answer yet. I'll take Steve first, if you can take a note of that. Steve, can you unmute yourself, or somebody unmute you?
I couldn't unmute myself, Joan. One of the things that's missing here is the discussion really about what education is for. We're all involved in education. Well, you and me are involved in it. You know, we've given our lives to it, Joan. But the whole notion of capitalism is that the university-educated elite think, well, we know better than nature. And that's the whole that is the philosophical, if you like, whatever it is, crux of capitalism. And they, you know, because they're the rich, they pay whoever it is they want to say whatever they want to say, and the rest of us just have to suffer. Now, the fact that you know, there is no vaccination way out of, you know, COVID is the consequence of pollution and climbing temperatures, and the vaccination doesn't address those issues. Neither does it most crucially address the issue that the university-educated elites think that the world is their playground. It isn't. We're not here to serve them. We're here to enjoy our common recreation on Earth until its natural end. Of course, that's never been embraced, accepted by the Labour Party. But at least there should be 1 or 2 people outside of the Labour. Oh, sorry, I'm in the Labour Party now. That should be able to articulate that a bit more clearly than's currently going on. I was hoping that Nick would have addressed that, seen the overlap. Sorry, no, I don't want to single out Nick, but the whole notion of global justice is that you can't have university, and they're principally white elites, but they've taught the black people, the black university elites, to do the same. You know better than the ordinary people who turn the earth. Well, they don't. They never did. They never will if they carry on that. Because we'll all have been fried before then. Thanks for letting me go on, Joan. All the best to you now.
Thanks very much, Steve. Terry.
I should, yes. I can unmute myself. Complicated because I can hear myself over there. 3 points. Firstly, I'm going to move. Sorry. Several people, Nick talked about the experience of HIV/AIDS as being a motivating factor, and it certainly is one of the things I've raised throughout this pandemic. And I know it's something that Fatima herself has been involved in. And I think it would be really important to trace the lessons that we collectively learnt in fighting HIV as a global health injustice, and what we haven't yet been able to bring to bear around COVID, because I think in terms of both racism, but also in terms of the power of big pharma, there's a lot to look at there. And that kind of brings me into my second point, which is, yes, I completely agree with you, Nick, that we have to be focusing things on Johnson as quickly as possible. Can we try and develop some more precise things in the course of the next half an hour so we can actually give people, even if it's just, let's have a Twitter storm on Thursday, or Global Justice Now will be announcing something, or Zero COVID will be announcing something, so that people don't go away with nothing concrete. And then finally, I completely agree with Karen saying this pandemic isn't over. But I think the other thing that we have to be conscious of is, with the environmental crisis, even when we deal with this zoonosis, there is every likelihood that we will be facing others, because our criminal relationship with the ecosphere that we live in is such that we're creating these pandemics, and without addressing the questions of the Biodiversity Summit and the questions of COP, we're not going to be safe, even when we've dealt with COVID. And that needs to be part of what we're arguing. Thank you.
Right. Cynthia's got her hand up, so I'll take Cynthia as well and then give you a list of things to answer. Cynthia, can somebody unmute Cynthia? No, nobody managing to do that. Terry, can you unmute Cynthia? Right. Does that work? I think you can unmute yourself, Cynthia.
Right. I see. Right. I got a note that said the host will not allow you to unmute yourself. Never mind.
Yeah, that's at the beginning. I think we can change
Sorry.
that
So
today.
sorry. Yeah, I've almost forgotten my question now. And it's wonderful to have Nick there to put questions to him, because I have so much admiration for what Global Justice Now do, and especially the leaflets and information they put out. And my question is, can you do something urgently? I'm thinking of an ABC of global economic organizations. It's been an obsession because we've spoken before about this, but COP, ICS and the NHS, COVID, all the same thing, corporate power. And the words that people do never hear, I think the WTO was mentioned twice in the news, probably about 6 months ago, and it disappeared. The people in this country go out and talk on doorsteps with people. They don't know, they're glazed over. You talk about the WTO. And as for the IMF, you know, the fact that these countries in Africa are still paying their debts while it's just never, they've no idea. And we've got to break that. And there just seems this huge resistance in the Labour Party to talk about anything like that. People need to know. And I think it's part of Brexit, because we were told out there we'd be free to make our own decisions. Well, actually, the WTO and the IMF are making them for us. So I suspect that's really what it's about with Boris. But why with the Labour Party? I don't get it. Thank you very much.
Right. Thanks very much, Cynthia. There's also a question in the chat from Janet about vaccine development in Cuba. So, Nick, do you want to go first? And then I'll come to Fatima to add on anything you've not addressed. Most of the questions seem to be addressed to you. Can you unmute? Is that working? I'm relying on Terry or Ian to...
There we are.
There we are. Right.
There we are. Great. Yeah, so let me deal with Starmer first, because this is really important, right? So the Labour Party produced a 10-point plan of how to deal with COVID internationally. It was not as clear as we would have liked, let me say that, on the need to waive patents internationally. When we pushed them on it, and we actually had quite a few tense discussions with them, they said, well, the implications of this are clearly that, yes, we would support you. And I kind of said, well, we'd like a bit more than the implication of that. Like, we'd like you to be saying this loud and clear. And I don't really see why you wouldn't, because opinion polls suggest that this is very popular, even marginally among Tory voters. They don't see a problem with overriding monopolies, particularly in the middle of a pandemic. At 6 o'clock this evening, for those of you in Brighton, I'll be at the Walrus pub, and we're having a fringe meeting. Preet Gill, the Shadow Secretary of State for International Development, will be on the panel, and we will be pushing them. I mean, we know Preet does support it, but it's like you said, rather like you said, I mean, you know, you'd really think that this could be far more of a bat to beat Johnson with at the moment, and we'd really like them to be doing more. So, you know, they're kind of there or thereabouts, but it needs to be way more. I completely agree. And the more we can do to push through CLPs, through the Parliamentary Labour Party, or wherever else we have influence, please do, and we can help with that. In terms of what next, we are going to kick off some days of action starting on the 2nd, which is the anniversary of the South Africa-India proposal to the WTO. There is a critical meeting of the WTO mid-October, something called the TRIPS Council. And the day before that, I know not all of you are going to feel comfortable doing this, but we're going to do a kind of day of shame in Westminster. We're going to do a funeral procession. It's going to be very somber. If people would like to come down to that, please look at our website or get in touch. But if you don't feel comfortable doing that, obviously, like as much as you can do online to raise awareness, we'll be doing some memes, we'll be releasing some figures. We've got the petition, but just hassle your local politicians. I mean, by and large, I think, unfortunately, politicians are not coming under the pressure that they should be on this. And that's one of the reasons they're not speaking out more. I mean, Tory MPs are almost universally said nothing on it. There are a couple, including Jeremy Hunt, actually, who has supported the TRIPS waiver, but whoever your MP is, please pressure them. Yeah, sorry, website globaljustice.org.uk, and you can find events on there. But also just email me as well, nick.dearden@globaljustice.org.uk. Look, Steve, I completely agree with you, and I'm sorry for not. It's the subject of a whole different meeting, really. But how these pandemics come about in the first place, I know we're still not clear exactly where COVID came from, but there's no question that pandemics are increasingly coming about. Diseases that create pandemics are increasingly coming about because of our encroachment into the ecosphere and onto nature. Absolutely right. And, you know, Boris Johnson's plan that we just need more and more trade deals, which are going to deregulate our food system and hand our food system over to industrial agriculture, just as one small example, is going to make that worse and worse and worse. You know, the shortages we're seeing at the moment are absolutely, I mean, they are caused by, you know, disruption in the labour supply because of Brexit, but there are really much more long-term structural causes behind what we're seeing in the global economy now. Capitalism is eating itself. You know, we just cannot continue exploiting people and the earth forever and ever and ever, and assume that everything's just going to continue as normal. So you're right. This is part of a much, much bigger fight. And I hope that through COVID, people are beginning to learn a little bit about how the global economy works. But I have to say that you're right, Cynthia. We've got much more work to do. I've been at TWT for the last couple of days now, the World Transformed down here in Brighton. Amongst young activists, there is a will and the values are right, but there is so little understanding of how the global economy works. We've not done a good enough job, and we need to communicate that better. And I'd love to work more with Zero COVID on that. I won't go on and on and on, and I'll probably leave Fatima to talk about the Cuba vaccines. But there is definitely some hope there.
Certainly think Zero COVID needs to publicise your activities far more than we have up to now. So if you can make sure we get the stuff and we'll pass it on. Fatima, did you want to come back on some of that stuff? Who's got control of the muting? Think you can probably do it yourself. Should work. Yes. No. Try again. Yeah, that's it.
Great. So just two quick points. And you know, I mean, I don't understand your political climate, but the one unusual ally has actually been Gordon Brown in this. And so while we were working on the Johnson & Johnson story, he actually wrote a blog about the 10 million vaccines that he had been told was about to be diverted from South Africa to Europe. And that kind of created the pressures, as Nick had said earlier, on the EU and J&J to agree to stop the export. So clearly Gordon Brown is being advised by some really good experts, but also he seems to have an into some African leaders who are actually, you know, conveying their frustrations to him. So I think there's a way in which, I mean, I've never been a fan of Gordon Brown, but I think there's a way in which we could use him, particularly in relation to some of the key messaging around what we need. And I think that links to how do we use Gordon Brown and people like him to actually ask for transparency around the Oxford University, AstraZeneca, British government, I don't know, there's many players in this agreement with the Serum Institute, because we know that the UK is a preferred customer in that contract. And they need to be removed as preferred customer, because we can't have the same situation like we've had with J&J, where Serum starts producing the AstraZeneca vaccines, and then it gets diverted to the UK for booster shots. It needs to immediately go to low-income countries. And that could be a small, low-hanging fruit victory to create a campaign around the transparency of all those agreements, to look at, I think, you know, we've talked about this before, but a public inquiry into the role of Oxford University and these academics who claim to have you know, found the solution to vaccine equity, but actually gave us the total opposite of that. And I think that Oxford University and some of its officials were actually duped or were even complicit in actually creating a system of vaccine apartheid through the various agreements that they eventually entered into and agreed upon. And so far from it being the people's vaccine, it's actually not. It's you know, the AstraZeneca vaccine as well has become a vaccine for the privileged part of the world. So if we don't sort that contract out and that agreement and have some kind of transparency and scrutiny around that whole arrangement, we could potentially have the same thing playing out that we had in early 2021, where serum starts producing, but then it actually goes to places that already have high vaccination rates and coverages. The other thing is, how we get the Labour Party to deal with this really ridiculous racist kind of response around the travel and the movement of people. Given that the UK was our former colonizer, I mean, I think there's a certain irony there. But Germany and the US are actually accepting people who have been vaccinated in America, in Africa or South America, with no requirement of quarantining, and will accept, the vaccination card that your country has given to you. So Italy, the UK are not, and we. I think this has to be called out. There needs to be a campaign around like stop the racism or whatever. It's just rooted in anti-science. And Nick, I was going to speak to you about this earlier, but that anti-science response is harming our efforts to tell people vaccinate, because people are saying, well, why should we vaccinate if in any event, if I want to go to Italy or the UK, it's not being recognized or accepted. You still have to go into quarantine. There must be something wrong with these vaccines. Why aren't they recognizing our vaccines? I mean, you and I know, because you're in this field, that it's the same damn vaccines. But, the ordinary person doesn't understand it. So it's, these kind of racist policies and approaches, and if you don't have, opposition politicians or parties calling it out, people think that it's actually rooted in science. And I think we have to elevate the anti-science argument around that, if you have a concern about whether a vaccine card is fraudulent or not, then you have to ban the entire US from entering the UK, because theirs is also, it's a simple card system. It's very easy to forge, and people have been forging it. So, just the double standards that I think that we could use people like Gordon Brown. But I mean, I can't believe I'm saying this, but I think we could use Gordon Brown a bit more for some of these issues. Thanks.
Thanks. Are there any other contributions or questions that people want to stick in? Terry Harper. Somebody unmute Terry? I've given up trying to work out how to unmute or mute. I think you should be able to do it yourself, Terry.
Hi.
That's it.
Yeah, it works the second time, apparently.
Yes.
Thanks so much for this really valuable meeting. I've just got a couple of points to raise. I've got a question for Fatima. I was stuck in South Africa for a year during COVID, and I heard on the radio, and let me tell the English people here that the South African radio, the journalists, the television is far, far more scientific and far more speaking about COVID all the time. I mean, it's just totally different to ours. And for those of you who are on the media group, that Zero COVID is running at the moment, there's some training tomorrow night. Again, for those of you who haven't been before, we're taking on the media basically. And it's really an excellent training course. I'd recommend it to all of you. But Fatima, when I was there, I heard on the radio a journalist saying that she'd just come out, that the health minister at the time had just come out of a meeting with a pharmaceutical company. And South Africa was desperately trying to get vaccines at the time. They had nothing. And he said quite clearly that that this company, this pharmaceutical company, I'm not sure if it was AstraZeneca, I can't actually remember, was asking for South African assets, for their natural resources and for other assets that belonged to South Africa before they were prepared to give vaccines. Now, she said this very quickly in passing on the Cape Talk radio station. And I was so shocked by this because I know nothing about trade. And I just wondered, from your point of view, whether this and the red list hasn't become a trade issue rather than a medical, moral, political issue, whether it's not just, simply I heard Boris Johnson a few days ago saying to somebody from South America, it was caught by the BBC or something, he was saying, why don't you buy AstraZeneca? You must buy AstraZeneca. Now, none of us are actually getting AstraZeneca anymore. We're only getting Pfizer in this country, and one other, but not AstraZeneca. And I don't know why he was saying that to this other president or something. And I just want your view about what the hell we can do about trade issues, if you think that's what it is. Thank you.
Dave Pedder, were you waving at me to put your hand up or not? I wasn't sure. No? Right, okay, I've got Veronica. Try unmuting yourself. I think we put it on the set. We've put it on the setting that you can unmute yourself. There you go.
You have to argue with it. Okay.
Yeah.
I'm a white African. I'm going back in history. I'm from Rhodesia. And the contribution I want to make is that I hear people talking about strategy and what the Labour should say and what the Tories should say. What I want to point out is I have understood for the last 40 odd years just how absolutely dastardly the British government is. And very often it doesn't matter which side you're on. And I think a lot of the arguments are about we need to tell them, we need to do this, we need to do the other. And I think really what we need to do is educate people. People get strength when they know the facts. It's not about party politics. It's not about a difference of opinion. It's that they are determined. I mean, the Trilateral Commission, which actually Keir Starmer, I don't know if he's still a member, but he was a member of it, is a group of people who want to dominate the world. So don't tell me he's Labour. He's never been Labour. I just think education, education, education. People aren't stupid, but they're not getting the facts. They're dosing on MSM opioids, and they think everything is okay. And I think our job is actually really educate them with the facts, because I think that is when people start coming back and saying this isn't right, it's not fair. So that's my contribution. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Thanks, Dave, for putting details of the media training workshop in the chat. So if people want to grab that while they can, I'm going to ask Fatima to come back on that and then Nick to sum up. Try it yourself and see if it works.
Yes, it is now.
Yes.
So yeah, Terry, thanks. I think this is the reason why, as Health Justice Initiative, we've actually filed access to information requests for the 2 vaccine contracts with Pfizer, Johnson & Johnson, and then whatever our governments have signed with COVAX and the AU. And similarly, access to information activists are doing this around the world, in the US, in Europe, and in Latin America. So what do we know about Pfizer? When we say that the CEO of Pfizer acts like God in a pandemic, we literally mean that, because these are the undertakings that they have asked governments for. And so we know that in Latin America that there was a requirement of national assets to be put up as surety for the contract with Pfizer to be signed in order to underwrite what's called the indemnity against liability and fund or scheme of compensation. Similarly, in South Africa, that was established rapidly. We don't ever do things within 5 days, but we suddenly quickly set up a liability and indemnity compensation fund to suit the demands of the 2 CEOs of Johnson & Johnson and Pfizer. And we believe that if we have access to these contracts, we will be able to see what else was given up, not just by the South African government, but by other governments around the world in the middle of a pandemic, in addition to the export waiver. So, you know, there's a certain irony around these countries that want the rule of law, they want the WTO rules to be in place. They, you know, lecture us about good governance and about democracy and about accountability, but all of the contracts are secret. In some countries, they are regarded as a state secret. In most countries, they have a non-disclosure agreement. So many of us are actually shooting in the dark. We don't know fully and completely and exactly what was actually given up in order to be able to get a deal with Pfizer and Johnson & Johnson or AstraZeneca or any of the other companies. We do know that our minister, who's since resigned, went on record as saying we had to choose between vaccinating people or fighting with the drug companies, and we chose vaccinating our people. So we believe we've given up a lot. We know that from the New York Times story around Johnson & Johnson, we're paying for vaccines filled and finished in South Africa. We're paying more for the J&J vaccine than you paying for it in Europe, even though we're filling and finishing here. So the entire system, I think, has gone cockeye. I don't think there's a better word that can explain what has actually really happened here. But it's rooted in profiteering. And so, Terry, I think you're right. It had nothing to do with public health. It had nothing to do with solidarity. It's definitely, particularly, I believe, for Pfizer and Johnson & Johnson, and to a certain extent AstraZeneca, is rooted in extracting as much profit as you can, and is basically premised on the notion of how do you exercise a monopoly in a pandemic where you extract as much as you can. What we do know, which Nick has talked about, the levels of profit that are estimated and expected, even from a company like Moderna that's never done an mRNA vaccine in its life before, is that as manufacturing opens up and as the next 3 to 4 years plays out, the levels of profit will gradually decline, because there'll be a greater selection of vaccines and because there could be greater manufacturing where the vaccines could actually be copied. So this year and next year are the years in which, if you are an investor or a board member or a CEO of a pharmaceutical company, these are the 2 years in which you're going to do everything in your power to block the waiver, to block greater sharing of know-how so that you can extract as much profit as you can, which is basically the total opposite of how you should be dealing with public health epidemic, as we've learned from HIV/AIDS. And so, you know, just on the Moderna thing, and Nick's organizations and ours have been talking about it, Moderna refused to come into South Africa. So in the middle of a pandemic, you have a highly effective vaccine, and Moderna, when we say they play God, the CEO of Moderna decides which country they will go into and which country they won't. So they're making these decisions based on the market, not based on public health need, right? They're refusing to share the technology, even though they say they won't enforce their patent. They're busy registering patents all over the place, we believe. And we're trying to follow that as well. So companies are preparing, I think, for the next 5 years about how to extract as much monopoly power as they can. And they're also deciding which countries they will go into or not. So in South Africa, Moderna has refused to submit their dossier to the regulator, which means we can't buy Moderna. Botswana has signed an agreement with Moderna, but the supplies haven't arrived. Moderna has signed an agreement with Saudi Arabia and Botswana, diamonds and oil, my view, but not the countries where we really have a serious COVID crisis, where we really need the vaccine. So how can you manage a pandemic where vaccines are publicly developed and they're available and they're safe and they're highly effective, but then you decide as a CEO whether a country will have access to your vaccine or not? And if you refuse to provide it to South Africa, you're not even allowing the hub that Nick has talked about that has been set up in South Africa to pool the technology, to use it. So now we have to go reverse engineer. I mean, that's ridiculous in a pandemic, to say to people, go try and figure it out yourself. Yes, we won't sue you, but go figure out the recipe yourself. I mean, that's just insanity.
Yeah. Thanks very much, Fatima. That is really useful information that I hope everybody's going to take in and will use. Nick, do you want to give a couple of minutes summing up and then we'll close the meeting? Let's see if the unmuting yourself is working.
Yeah, there we are. Great. Yeah, thanks very much. And Fatima, I'm going to actually put your points about the racist vaccination policy to the Labour shadow ministers tonight at our fringe meeting. Let's see, maybe we can get in touch with Gordon Brown as well and do something about this. This seems like something we should be able to win, you know, reasonably quickly. Let's see. Look, I just want to leave people with a thought. I think that for me, although this can be very depressing to talk about, geopolitical plates are starting to move, I feel, in a way I've not seen for a long time on the global economy. And I think an awful lot of countries in the world have woken up to the reality that, you know, relying for everything you need on the international marketplace is not going to serve them in the times ahead. And we're not going to go into they're not going to go into another situation like they went into this one, kind of believing the promises and pledges of wealthy countries. When you start getting diplomats speaking like campaigners, I think you know something is going on. And the UN Secretary General lecturing wealthy countries at the UN General Assembly last week was something to behold. You know, he said this is a moral indictment of the state of the world. It's an obscenity, right? This is not language that the UN Secretary General normally uses to talk about some of his members. So that gives me some hope. And look, we're turning the corner here on 40 years of free market fundamentalism and neoliberalism. Interestingly, one of the reasons the WHO went into this crisis in a weak position is because, you know, back in the 1970s, the WHO was an important global institution, international institution, that believed that healthcare should be a human right for everyone in the world. And the United States under Reagan said, no, healthcare can be a commodity. You can make a lot of money for it. And they started systematically defunding the World Health Organization. And I think this pandemic has given us the opportunity, at least, to make the case that that model has completely and utterly failed the majority of people on the planet, and to begin rebuilding those institutions so that we can ensure healthcare is a human right. You look at the mRNA technology that we've talked about a lot today. This is not just about COVID. This is a revolutionary technology. They're talking now about an HIV vaccine. They're talking about vaccines for certain types of cancer. They're talking about vaccines for malaria. This is why these corporations want to keep a monopoly on this technology, right? It's super important for all of us. We cannot allow that to happen. The stakes couldn't be higher. And I think even beyond healthcare, you know, this effectively, you've got intellectual property rules here which are right at the center of a form of what I can only describe as monopoly capitalism. And that form of monopoly capitalism is driving our entire world over the edge of a cliff. You know, it is not going to help us in any way deal with climate change. It's going to be a major hindrance. It is not going to help us build a sustainable food system where small farmers around the world are in control of their livelihoods and are producing decent quality food for the people in their localities and their societies. It is not going to allow us to deal with the huge human rights challenge presented by the power of big tech that currently monopolizes our communications with each other. All of this stuff needs to be changed. And the rules we're talking about here, the rules we're challenging as part of this COVID campaign, are rules that need to be challenged across the board. We need to end monopoly capitalism and change the way that we produce things. And, you know, I know that sounds like a big ask, but I really think COVID has made a lot of people wake up, a lot of governments in the South, movements in the South, but also movements in the North, and even some governments in the North. And so I think there's never been a better time to push on it. And really, you know, while you obviously can get depressed when you look at what's happening around the world, and I do, I also think this feels to me like a major turning point, and we've got to capitalize on it the best way we can. And so I really look forward to working with you all in the weeks and months and years to come to do that.
Thank you so much, Nick. Thank you so much, Fatima. And in his absence, thank you so much, Karam. I think everybody's really enjoyed this meeting. It will be available, I hope, on YouTube. So do tell your friends who haven't been able to come, because lunchtime is complicated, especially if people who are actually at conference where there's competing fringe meetings, as well as the desire to go and have a drink and have some lunch and talk to your friends. So thank you ever so much, everybody. And as I put in chat, if you want to know more, if you're not already involved in Zero COVID, then go to our website and you can sign up there. And also the Global Justice website has a lot of information about the People's Vaccine. And I really do think we need to link up with global justice to make sure, certainly over the next couple of months up until that WTO meeting, that we give it absolute priority, because it is so, so important. We can't fight against COVID in this country unless we do it globally. Thank you ever so much, everybody. Thanks.